Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining today's GMAT Club live video session, the focus of which is going to be MBA interviews. I imagine the folks joining today have just applied, probably in that wild flurry of round 2 deadlines, which is always super concentrated and can be quite stressful. I know this year it was, I feel like, even more concentrated than most years, with Wharton on January 3rd, and then 16 of the top 20 schools had their deadlines the following week. There was a little bit of a tail after that with MIT and NYU's third deadline last week. So finally, we're out of the woods on applications, and we're into interview prep. I know clients we've worked with have begun to receive some interview invites. If you haven't, by the way, that's fine too. You can look at your school's deadline pages and interview processes. Some of them will release interview invites on a rolling basis. Others will do so all on a single date. Others will do so on an ongoing basis until a certain date. So read up on that. Don't stress. Don't pay too much attention to what's going on the live wires and things like that. But as we look ahead to interview prep, whether some of those are trickling in for you now or they're going to be coming in the next few weeks, let's start thinking about how we can prepare for interview prep, for MBA interviews, what we can watch out for, how we could start to customize, hyper customize for certain schools, how you could start to map out your answers. This presentation, we hope, can also serve as something of a precursor to GMAT Club's big marquee event coming up. It runs January 29th to February 20th. There's one or two, there's the link at the bottom of the screen. These are interview tips for the top 15 or 16 schools. I believe they're doing the M7 and maybe LBS one by one. There'll be one session dedicated to each of those schools. I myself am actually hosting a multi-school session on February 11th that will cover kind of like the T8 to 16. Haas, Tuck, Yale, Darden, Fuqua, NYU Stern, Michigan Ross, Cornell Johnson, UCLA Anderson. I'll be doing all those all at once. So stay tuned for that. Those are free sessions, although I do not believe those will be available on YouTube after. I think for those, you have to join during the live session. Some of them will include mock interviews. This video will be available on YouTube after, and hopefully in perpetuity. So without further ado, let's dive in. This was billed as how to answer the most common MBA interview questions. We're definitely going to sink our teeth into that and give you some frameworks and stuff to work with. At the same time, I really would like to take a look. You could see this subtitle, oops, if you want to call it that, here as well. There we go. You can see this subtitle here as well, how to master the differences between schools' interview styles, formats, and question patterns. Our agenda for today. I am not in presentation mode. I know that if you look back, if you've joined any of my videos in the past, I'm almost never in presentation mode because a lot of what I like to do is interactive. We're going to click between some screens. We're going to go into Google Docs and map out some frameworks for interview prep and how you could kind of sketch out some of your answers. We're going to do that live. What I don't like to do on presentations like this, or when I work with clients, when we work with clients, I don't like to deal in generalities. I like to, let's bring the rubber to the road, if that's the right metaphor. Let's really try to map things out and help you start to build your own mental frameworks for, in this case, these interview questions. We will do a quick intro to MBA interviews, talk about how to approach and begin to prep for your MBA interviews, just because where we are in the cycle, these are probably coming or forthcoming or just beginning to come for you. I do, again, want to pay attention to those differences in interview format styles and patterns. We won't be able to address every school in depth on that, but we can definitely look at some of these either not so subtle differences or subtle differences, which are still important to pay attention to and can influence how we think about our preparation. The bigger ticket items are highlighted in yellow. Those are common MBA interview questions and how to approach answering them. as well as how to go about building your own school-specific question banks. GMAT Club has a fantastic tool for this. It's not going to do the work for you, but it can help you aggregate. And we're going to walk through, you can see it at the bottom of the page there, how to use, organize, and interpret GMAT Club's interview debriefs, what to watch out for. We'll pull a bunch of examples up from the M7, Booth, Columbia, Kellogg, MIT Sloan, Stanford. I've got some questions aggregated. We'll talk about how to kind of navigate those and what to watch out for. I am Greg Guglielmo. I'm the founder of Avanti Prep. We are a top-rated boutique MBA admissions consulting firm. We are extremely high touch. We really encourage people to go out and read our reviews. We've partnered with GMAT Club since 2017. We've been featured on Poets and Quants top consultant list for a number of years in a row. Our interview prep is equally high touch. It's very school specific and it's very you specific. I think a lot of what else you encounter in the marketplace, it's like, oh, we'll do a quick 30-minute mock interview. We'll give you 30 minutes of feedback. That feedback in 30 minutes on a whole interview is inevitably very general and generic feedback. We have clients we work with 3 to 5 hours on interview prep for a given school. We could spend 30 minutes just on why Booth, just on why Kellogg. We could spend 20 minutes just on tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. The point is that what we do together is real kind of response workshopping and response iteration and response refinement. So please take a look at our website, avantiprep.com. You can please read our testimonials. We've got a section that covers, some people we've done interview prep only with, but really 85% of the clients we work with, we do interview prep with pretty much everybody. So almost every review up on our website is going to be people who we done interview prep with. I've personally done, at this point, over 300 school-specific interview sessions. And I hope that some of that school-specific knowledge, again, can come across in this presentation. We are offering a special 15% discount to event attendees today using that code GMATClub15 at checkout. You'll find interview prep up on our website. You can add it. You can use the code at checkout. If I have any existing clients joining this call today, they already receive an existing client discount. These two things cannot be combined, but we hope to help whoever we can. We do have on our team, last comment on this, we do have on our team Morgan Bernstein. She's the former head of admissions at Berkeley Haas. She spent 12 years on the admissions team there, whereas a lot of other folks out there might have had a little bit of admissions experience. Morgan was the head of the team for 4 of those 12 years. She's available not only for Haas interview prep, of course, but for other types of interview prep. We have some other M7 and beyond former interviewers on our team as well. MBA interviews, how do these work? I hope I'm not repeating things here that you all already know. But again, because we're in pretty early, we just finished round 2 apps, and it's just in this last 5 to 7 days, we've shifted our brains toward interview prep. So I hope that these things are helpful. I'll try not to spend a ton of time on them. MBA interviews are usually by invitation only, but not always. A lot of you will know that already because, Kellogg interviews most or almost all applicants. Tuck lets you apply by December 1st or September 1st, and you guarantee yourself an interview. Duke and Darden have open interview periods, so you're familiar with some of that. But usually, for the most part, they're still by invitation only. I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this presentation, don't stress about when exactly you're hearing it. It's natural to look on GMAT Club and be on Reddit and look at the live wire and see what else is coming in. But just trust what it says on these schools' pages. You just don't know behind the scenes what order things are being read in. Some schools, again, will send out all their interview invites on a certain date. Others will kind of roll them out up until a certain date. So, just let the process unfold. These interviews are usually conducted by admissions personnel, alumni, or students. If it's alumni or students, they're going to be trained on this. But you could look this up. Look this up for any school that you're interviewing with. They'll usually just say it right there on their website. We know that, Harvard and MIT, they use admissions personnel for essentially all their interviews, or sometimes other kind of MBA office or admissions adjacent people. It could be somebody who runs a certain office at Harvard Business School. We've seen that, or kind of hired interview professionals, but it won't be students or alumni for Harvard or MIT. Others will be a mix, and they're all treated equally. It's all treated equally, but it's important to know and pay attention to who is interviewing you, because that can dictate your approach to the interview a little bit, and it can certainly dictate the questions that you ask if you are afforded that opportunity. Harvard actually doesn't have you ask questions at the end, but most other schools you will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end, and you could tailor those questions based on who you're interviewing with. So that's important to kind of flag and know. Interviews are usually, I'm going to say 30 to 45 minutes. Some can go longer, 60 minutes. When you go to the GMAT Club interview debrief tool and you look up certain schools here, you'll often see, let me put booth in. You'll have people who note how long their interview is. You can see that person's interview was 47 minutes. This person's interview was about 55 minutes. So you can get a sense there as well. They could sometimes vary in length. I would say alumni are probably the most guilty of letting them go a little bit longer or having a higher degree of variance, just because, they might love sitting there chatting about their school, but pay attention to that. And sometimes schools will tell you roughly how long they are. Other schools, again, I'll use Harvard, maybe NYU Stern, maybe MIT in this category, where it's, I think, more of a strict 30 minutes. Harvard, definitely, it's a strict 30 minutes. So look around, pay attention to that. These interviews are usually blind. In MBA interview land, blind means they've only seen your resume. There's some, again, exceptions to this. Virginia Darden is completely blind. The interviewer has not even seen your resume. Harvard, MIT, NYU, they've seen your whole application. So pay attention to those things as well. None of these are secrets. You can look them up online. Do not underestimate the importance of your interview. A lot of people, you're going through this process, you've put so much into it. What we don't want to happen is now you say, oh, great, I got invited to interview. Hey, I'm usually a pretty good communicator. I'm usually a pretty good interviewer. I'm not going to prep much, or I'm just going to mail it in. We don't want that. You got to take these seriously. There's a lot of thought and dot connecting and messaging and talking point development that we want to make sure we pay attention to. Interviews are one more data point in your process. It's not like so I know it comes after you've applied usually. So a lot of people think, okay, I've made it through the application gauntlet, and now I'm going to be evaluated on just my interview. That's not the case. The interview is one more data point. You had the credentials and your applications were strong enough to get invited to interview. Now they have that extra data point through the interview, and that's going to get put back in with everything else. So the interview is not all or nothing. You could have a fantastic interview, but maybe your application just, other things weren't clicking. You end up on the wait list. You could have a terrible interview, or bad, maybe not terrible, but maybe not your best interview, and you might still get in. So they are one more data point, but we want to make sure you have the best possible interview that you can. You will see the word conversational attached to a lot of interviews. I don't love the word. I think that when you see that word, people are usually suggesting to you, hey, they're not there to scare you. They're not there to trick you or stump you. But conversational in this case does not mean informal. And it does not mean it's a two-way conversation like it would be over a dinner or over a meal or over a cup of coffee. The interviewer is asking you questions. They ask, you answer. They ask, you answer. They ask, you answer. And then at the end, you will usually have the opportunity to ask them questions. But it's not like a two-way conversation. This is a professional event. You should be yourself. You should be comfortable. They're generally not going to be there to trick you or make you feel uncomfortable. That's what they mean by conversational. It's not a two-way conversation. It's still a professional event. Because it's a professional event, you should wear business formal attire. So if it were me right now, I would have to have a tie, and a suit jacket on as well. Probably really a whole suit if I were going in person. So business formal, not business casual, unless there are a few schools that in recent years have explicitly permitted business casual. If you don't see that, if you have gotten an email from your school explicitly saying business casual is okay, then it is business formal, suit and tie for for male applicants, or whatever the gender equivalents would be for that. Whatever you would wear to a business formal suit and tie type level event, that's what we're wearing here, unless you are explicitly permitted otherwise. Show up early, turn your phone off, make sure your screen is good. Don't be meek back like this. Don't be too close to the camera. You want to be square into it and, solid shoulders. Send a thank you note afterward. Don't ask how you did during the interview. I feel like that's obvious, but we hear one or two questions like that every year. So no, don't ask, are you going to recommend me, or how did I do? That's off limits. This slide I did not have originally in there. This is from an old presentation. It's just a little bit more about what I just talked about. Couple of additional points here. This is really we're going to do some of this today. Research, well, not researching the school. You apply to these schools. You should research them more, but research their interview format. Research their interview reports. Look for patterns about question types and styles in their interviews. We're gonna go through some of that. As far as getting to know the school, inhale the propaganda of the school. I say that tongue in cheek. But do that in the days and weeks leading up to your interview. You want to just inundate yourself and familiarize yourself deeply with what they stand for. Not just the resources there, but also their culture, their community, their mission statement. If you spoke to some students when you were applying, maybe you revisit one or two of those conversations. But be current on the school. Have this stuff at the tip of your tongue. Inhale the propaganda of the school. Some things that we want to pay attention to in here. I don't need to repeat those. But I will say this down here because it speaks to some of what we'll cover in the next little while. I'm going to give you some structures today, some blueprints, some frameworks to work with. Use those as a basis, but try not to sound scripted in your answers or robotic in your answers. We also want to make sure that we are specific in our answers, but succinct at the same time. That's tough to do. That's really tough to do in your essays. You were dealing with 250 word essays and 300 word essays. You had to pack a lot into those. Same idea here. The typical MBA interview answer is probably 2 minutes, 2 to 2.5 minutes, maybe 3 minutes for a why Booth, why Kellogg, why our school question, maybe 2.5 to 3 minutes for tell me about yourself. I'm okay with a little longer for those, but 2 minute, why MBA? 2 minutes. Don't go down rabbit holes. You got to be specific and succinct at the same time. I talked about business formal. I talked a little bit about your video. We should, and I'm trying to do it right now too. You want to, if you're doing a video interview, create the sensation of eye contact during it. So what I often try to do, I'm doing it a little bit right now, is shrink my screen a little bit and put it as close to underneath my camera as I can, so that when I'm looking at the screen, at the other person or at yourself, it creates the sensation of eye contact. You don't want to, okay, well, right now I'm still looking at the screen, but I moved it to the bottom of my page. Now it doesn't look like I'm making eye contact. Create, in a video interview, create the sensation of eye contact. Be square to the camera. Check your lighting, check what's behind you, all the usual stuff. Check your connection beforehand. Sometimes schools will ask for your ID. Just, have it handy. I think most of them probably have this as a policy, but don't necessarily do it. Be ready with questions at the end of the interview. If we have time later on, we could talk about that. Probably, at least 3 questions, a 3-question baseline, but you got to be nimble. You got to look at the clock. You got to be respectful of their time. If it's an alum on a Saturday and they're ready to chat with you, you're having a cup of coffee and they're ready to sit with you for an hour, don't cut yourself short either. But if it's somebody in the middle of their workday and they put a hard stop in at a certain time, maybe you ask your 2 questions, ask one, let them answer, ask your second, let them answer. And then you say, I do have 1 or 2 other questions. I just want to be cognizant and respectful of your time. I know we had, marked our calendars to wrap this up in about 5 minutes. Do we have time for 1 or 2 more questions? And they say, yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah. 2 more questions would be fine. Just feel that out and be, respectful of people's time, be aware. But again, don't cut yourself too short either if there's some good conversation momentum going. Be confident but humble, avoid self-centeredness, avoid self-aggrandizement, avoid take, avoid me. Again, it's conversational, but they are driving the bus. They ask, you answer, etc. And then you'll have your chance at the end for questions. Common MBA interview question types. I bucket them into these 4 categories. These are my own terminology. These are my own categorizations. This was an effort over the years to distill something that can feel a little bit intimidating, understandably, and a little bit new. You go to an interview report, right? You make sure, by the way, when you go to GMAT Club's interview report resource, make sure you filter over here for your specific school that you're interested in. You open these up and you say, gee, there's tons of interview reports on here and there are tons of questions. How do I distill these? So a nice way to organize them is into these 4 categories. This will also help you, and we'll do this live together, start to look for patterns that exist between different schools. Again, sometimes subtle patterns, sometimes not so subtle patterns, very different styles or formats. GMAT Club, again, is hosting their event, school-specific event series, January 29th, February 20th. I will be hosting the one on February 11th. Some of those differences that exist between schools, I said some are subtle, some are not so subtle. On the not so subtle side, Harvard has a totally distinct and unique and different to prepare for and super challenging interview. It's kind of almost a case method style interview in its origins. It's 30 minutes. It's with somebody from admissions or admissions adjacent. It's a little more rapid fire. You're probably looking at 15 to 20 questions. Let's call it 20 questions in that 30-minute period. It's a totally distinct interview. We do a ton of prep for that. We have had a tremendous amount of success on Harvard interview prep. So if you do encounter that, we'd love to work with you on it. I would probably put our track record up against anyone on Harvard and Stanford interview prep and on interview prep in general. So Harvard's a little tougher to cover. I don't think we'll really be able to cover it here. It's a totally distinct interview style. They also have the post-interview reflection that's due within 24 hours of the interview. Stanford, it kind of fits in a way into this pattern, but Stanford focuses a lot on these behavioral questions. Behavioral questions, by the way, that just means tell me about a time when. They are example-driven questions. So Stanford really orients its interviews around behavioral questions, usually something like 4 of them, and they are gonna, whereas most other schools just let you answer, the behavioral questions in like 2.5 minutes without interruption or unlikely interruption. Stanford is going to probe and interrupt and press and stop you. Why did you do that first? What were you thinking? Why did you reach out to that person first? How did they react? So you could get these 4 kind of main behavioral questions for Stanford, each around a different topic, but then they might ask 4, 6, 8, 10 sub-questions or prompts and probes as you kind of reveal or walk through that example. Darden's a little bit different too. Again, if you look at this stuff and you're not super familiar with it, you might not realize, but Darden on its face might look like By the way, Stanford doesn't only ask those questions. You'll often also see why MBA, why Stanford, and maybe one or two other questions. But the main corpus of the interview for Stanford is around those behaviorals. Darden has kind of a tricky opening question in recent years where they, instead of just tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume, it's almost like this big open-ended, walk me through everything. Walk me through your journey to this point and how you got here and what you're looking ahead to. It can turn into almost like they're almost inviting you to give like a 10-minute kind of monologue style opening. Here's somebody reporting that right here. The first 10 to 15 minutes were dedicated to the classic, tell me about yourself. But key difference. And here, look, tell me about yourself. And they specifically asked me to do it in 5 to 10 minutes. That is super different from almost every other school. Almost every other school opens with tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. But that's just, in most other cases, it's a movie trailer, 2 to 3 minute answer. Darden specifically wants you to click into more chapters of your story. This takes a lot of thought and prep and response design in advance. We work with people on that all the time. So pay attention to that for Darden. Harvard has the post-interview reflection. MIT Sloan requires 2 extra essays when you are invited to interview. They're 250 words each. One is related to kind of creating a welcoming environment. The other is related to a data visualization. Booth has an extra 60-second video or a 60-second video. So those are when you're invited to interview. So those are some of the more explicit, not so explicit differences. Even more subtle differences are down here. What are the duration differences in these interviews? Are they always 30 minutes when I look at the interview reports or I read up about them online? Are there style differences between interviewers? Do maybe admissions interviewers stay a little closer to the book and you see, I don't know, alumni interviewers might have a propensity to follow their own style? You just got to be aware of and ready for some of these potential differences. How consistent do a school's questions seem to be? I'll pick on my own alma mater here, Berkeley Haas. They have been quite consistent. I have found their interview reports to be quite consistent in recent years. They have a great professor there, Don Moore, who's done a lot of research around the consistency of interview and interview questions, really for the workplace. But I suspect that some of that might have trickled into their own approach to interviewing candidates. But just look, when you read interview reports, look for this kind of variance in the frequency of questions. What is the preferred opening question for a certain school? We'll look at some examples of this. For most schools, it's tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. But you'll usually be able to spot some differences here. You know, NYU Stern, the last couple of years, I've seen them ask people to, they'll ask people about something from their Pick 6 presentation. It can happen. It doesn't always happen. Kellogg, just this year, I'm seeing a little more variance in their opener relative to the typical tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. MIT Sloan, for years, instead of asking the regular opener, would ask, have there been any updates or changes since your application? Well, gee, if you don't know that that's coming, you could give a very flat, no, I don't think so. Well, that's kind of a waste of a response. If you know that question is coming, or at least you're ready for it if it does come, then you could have a thoughtful, it doesn't have to be like a black and white change, but you've probably had some updates. By the time MIT does their interviews a few weeks from now, 4 to 6 weeks might have elapsed since you've applied. Well, be ready to give something. It's not like, it doesn't have to be like an updated GMAT score, but is there something from work? 2 or 3 things that you could update them on to set an interesting tone and provide interesting substance for the interview. So do schools have a preferred opener? How do the behavioral questions vary? And what are the patterns that exist there? Tell me about a time when. Do they seem to orient around or favor certain of those? Does a certain school ask a particular one-off question? Columbia and Duke Fuqua are the 2 schools I always think of as asking where else you've applied. Be ready for that. Those are one-offs that seem unique. Some schools will ask about your plan B for your career goals. Others will have other oddball questions. And you could look for some of these tendencies in the interview reports. How many behavioral questions do they usually ask? Is another thing, is it 1 or 2? Is it 3 or 4? Do they ask these kind of self-awareness questions? So, all right, how to answer these types of questions. The core questions. I think of there as being 5 core questions. They're on the page right here, highlighted in yellow, that you want to be ready for any MBA interview. Tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. What are your short and long-term career goals? Why MBA? Why now? Why our school? And how you will uniquely contribute. It does not mean that you're going to get all 5 of these questions in every interview. It doesn't mean you're going to get them all separately. But you want to be ready for all 5 of these. Some schools will omit, they might not ask the goals question explicitly. They might skip straight ahead to these. Okay, what do you do in that instance? So other schools will merge all of these together or merge some of these together. They'll say, what are your career goals? Why MBA and why our school? Why Kellogg? Why Booth? You got to look out for, you will often be able to see some of these potential patterns in the interview reports. You want to be ready for and nimble on how to handle these questions, either separately or together. We'll talk about that in a minute. How you'll uniquely contribute. Some schools ask that, other schools don't. I think we want to make sure that in most MBA interviews that comes across. Okay, so let's tackle these. Tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. This is the classic opener. If I had to put a percentage on it, I would say like 80% of schools use this as the first question. You walk in or you join the video, exchange pleasantries. When did you land? When did you fly in? Did you visit class today? Or how's the weather? Whatever, pleasantries. They'll introduce themselves for like a minute or two. Then they'll turn it over to you and say, so that's me. Why don't you go ahead and tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume? I treat those 2 versions of the question as functionally equivalent. I do not recommend that, nor would I adapt my answer based on the nuanced difference between tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. They are both, to me, code for introduce yourself. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Let's kick this off. Again, for most schools, other than that Darden example I was pointing to, this is like a 2 to 2.5, maybe 3-minute max opening salvo. It's the movie trailer version of you. You're going to go into the detail afterward. The big trap people fall in with this question is they talk for too long. They talk for 5 to 10 minutes. That's too much. 2 to 3 minutes, 2.5, 3 minutes. You got to think about the parts and practice this. What could those parts be? What should those parts be? And what should you focus on in here? And I'm going to flip over probably to this document so we can map some of this out. So let me know if this is not zoomed in enough. So this question is, tell me about yourself. You'll sometimes see it as walk me through your resume. The parts I've got written here are basically these. An opening, job 1, job 2, and what you do outside of work. We want to give this a little bit of structure. By the way, this is not the only way to answer this question. I've seen and heard other ways. If you want to take kind of a creative approach or creative stroke with it, more power to you. I'm trying to give you what I think is a kind of classic toolkit and framework to work with for this question. So walk through your resume or tell me about yourself. I think the first part of this is something about your background. Very brief, but I think my name is Greg. I grew up in the New York area. Like, it could be something as basic as that, but acclimate them with who you are. Where did you grow up? If you are, for me, that might just be something like a quick sentence. My name is Greg. I grew up in the New York area. I attended Georgetown University for undergrad, where I majored in government and minored in Italian. You want to then go into why, probably a quick sentence, why you chose your undergraduate university, why you chose your undergraduate major. But something like a little quick sentence about background. If you're somebody who has something very unique to their background, either where you grew up or moving around a lot, or a parent was in the military, or you moved between different countries or cultures, that's definitely worthy. of mentioning in that kind of quick background opener. But I think it's kind of quick. Let's call it quick background. I think then we're into college. You could almost potentially think of these as an opener together, but then we're into college. Where you went, what you studied, and quickly in like a sentence or two, why you chose those. That word why, I had it highlighted over here. That's really, I think, the extra color that we want to make sure comes across with this response. Some schools now, I've seen a little bit with Kellogg, they'll even say like, walk me through your resume, focusing on the motivation behind your choices, or tell me about yourself, focusing on, the reason you chose to do what you've done to this point. Even if they don't ask why, we want to make sure that those whys are in this answer. So like, where did you go? What did you study? Why? And if you had any noteworthy extracurriculars, very quickly, again, this whole answer is going to be like 2 minutes. I take much longer to explain what should be in the answer than your actual answer should be. Why did you choose these? Any noteworthy events or extracurriculars? But like a sentence or two. You're not telling a whole story about them. You say, during college, I was my life outside of academics was defined by my involvement in X. Or outside of the classroom, the two biggest things that, the two biggest elements of my experience were blank and blank. You're not telling a story about those yet. You're just mentioning them, putting them on the radar. They're part of the fabric of who you are and your leadership or your experience or your impact at that university. Let's just say that this person had 2 jobs. I'm almost going to put this in parentheses because it's pretty quick. It's like a sentence. Okay, as graduation approached, now focus on the transition into job 1. Mostly why, maybe a little bit of how, how you got the job. Don't go into tons of detail on that. Now you're into job 1. For job 1, if your company is not super duper well known, maybe it's a startup, maybe it's kind of obscure, maybe it's a family business, we need a sentence about what the company or maybe your team does. What does the company or team do? Especially, you could maybe omit that if it's like the JP Morgan Investment Bank. I mean, you don't need to put a sentence in there, but you could still say what team you're on within the JP Morgan Investment Bank. As part of JP Morgan's investment banking group, I was specifically assigned when I joined to the financial institutions group, the FIG team, where our clients are blah, 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 or we work on advising such and such clients. So one sentence, what does the company or team do? One sentence, what do you do in the role? I should scroll these down. But like really one sentence. Really one sentence. And then I like to put 1 or 2 highlights here. Probably the biggest highlight of my 3 years as a fixed income analyst at JP Morgan were blank and blank. Just mention them. You're not telling the whole story about those. You could tell a whole story about them later on. If they say, tell me about a time you led a team, or tell me about a time you overcame a challenge, then you're giving a 2 or 3 minute story. 1 or 2 highlights. The 2 biggest highlights were leading XYZ and organizing blah, 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 blah. We're analyzing our first ever blah, 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 blah. Now transition into job 2. Why you pursued it, maybe a little bit of how. Again, these are like a sentence. And then do the same thing for job 2. Outside of the office, I'm really passionate about blah, 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 blah. And very active in such and such, such and such. In fact, just last month, I organized and led our first ever nationwide charity fundraiser. I'm also into running and biking and hiking, whatever. Quick, but again, keep these tight. That's outside of the office. So that's me. Happy to answer any questions you have, and I look forward to sharing, what I hope is ahead, or more about your goals or whatever. A little sloppy on that bow tie. I call that a bow tie at the end. You could put a little bow tie on it to indicate to them that you've concluded your answer. So that's me, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have and share more about my goals and interest in Haas. Something like that, the bow tie. So work with that, run with that. Hard to do kind of, in 5 or 10 minutes here, but that's a potential construct. Try to work with that, try to make it yours. Gets a little complicated when you have multiple jobs, right? If you had 4 jobs, I would say don't do this for all 4 of your jobs. If you had 4 jobs, cluster them a little bit, or only spend a sentence. My first 2 jobs were blank and blank, but then lead into and do this for jobs 3 and 4. That's very important, actually, because if you have 4 jobs, we see a little bit more these days, multiple jobs. You don't want to talk forever on this answer. What are your short and long-term career goals? That's the second big core question. So here was the first. You will see. Look, we could peek down at Booth, by the way. I got it right here. This is from the interview reports. You'll see some of the different combinations that these come across in. But as a default, we want to be ready for what are your short and long-term career goals. Some schools will just say, what are your immediate post-MBA career goals? You saw that on the when you did the applications. Some schools will ask short and long, others will ask just short. We want to be ready for both. You got to pay attention in the interview to what they're asking. I think the 3 parts for this are, and not necessarily in this order, these are the 3 parts I think should be in there, are what exactly are the short-term goals? What exactly are the long-term goals? And why are these goals your goals? There could be a little bit of genesis of the goals that kind of comes across. Genesis of these goals. There could be, what grander impact are you hoping to have? What bigger picture problem are you hoping to solve? A couple of typos in here. These are the parts. These, I think, are the 3 important parts that exist within this answer. Different people, literally in essays, every applicant, every person we work with in an interview prep, these orders can vary. Some people open with the why, then do short, then do long. Some people open with the long, then back into the short as a way to get to the long, and then say why these goals are their goals and what the passion and purpose is behind them, and what bigger picture problem they're hoping to solve, what attracted them to these goals, the passion and purpose behind these goals. So those are the 3 parts, though, that exist in here. When I say what exactly are the goals, for something like a short-term goal, we want to know, same thing in your essays. Now, maybe you didn't do it to this level of specificity. Ideally, you would have in your essays. If you got invited to interview, hopefully you did. But I want to know not just industry or generally what your goals are post-MBA. I want to know target industry, target companies, specific roles, specific teams, specific geographies. You don't always know exactly what teams you hope to land, that you're going to land on, or what offices, but you can still share ideally, what those might be. If you're going into consulting, most MBA graduates will be a generalist for 2 years, but you can and should still say that after those 2 years as a generalist, covering different functions, projects, cases, engagements, clients, companies, industries. I really hope to specialize in, and then after 2 years, most consultants will develop either a functional expertise or an industry expertise. So say what group you hope to join within what practice area within your consulting firm, and why, and what projects you hope to work on, what impact you hope to have. There's a high bar for specificity. When you mention these companies and jobs, they should be consistent with your application, by the way. The interviewer has not seen your application usually, but these goals should obviously be consistent with what you've written there. This could be an opportunity if you felt like you were insufficiently specific in your application. Here's a chance to add those layers of specificity. Long-term goals are always a little further off in a field, but try to be specific about those as well. Sometimes there's a little medium-term goal in here. Is there something, I don't know, if you leave investment banking after 3 to 5 years, is there something you would hope to do between years 6 and 10 before pursuing this longer-term vision? Why are these goals your goals? Again, I talked about that. If there are other things that are relevant, like you've, I don't know, you've already taken some meaningful steps toward these goals, you could probably pepper that in here as well. I know some schools are really paying attention to, all schools are paying attention to the viability and credibility of these goals. Some schools, I would say, even kind of excessively so. With your short-term goals also, by the way, I mean, you should have ideally engaged with the school, understood its interview reports, understood its recruiting dynamics, spoken with people at the school who are recruiting into the same industry as you hope to, and you should understand what companies recruit at that school. So when you cite examples of companies, you don't cite companies that never recruit at that school. You want that to be kind of tailored and targeted, not only to your interests, but to who actually recruits at the school. That's goals. Again, kind of quick and dirty here because we got a lot to get through, but that's how I would approach the goals question. Why MBA? Why now? Often asked together. Again, listen to the question, hear what they're asking. All right, for why MBA, why now? I'm going to flip over to this slide. So this is a visual representation of what I think is essentially a master career narrative or a master professional narrative that exists or sits behind every application, and in this case, every set of core interview questions. We just talked about your post-MBA vision. That's highlighted here in yellow. You see the 3 parts that I just deconstructed: short-term goals, long-term goals, and why those goals are your goals: the passion, the purpose, the impact. That was as its own question a moment ago. Now they're asking you why MBA. They're asking you this part. And I think to get there, we want to think a little bit about this as well. What you already have. Your why MBA are your gaps, what you need concretely from the MBA program. So think of it this way. I just told you, again, we're answering here, why MBA, why now? I just told you my post-MBA vision. I just shared those goals with you. Now, as I look ahead to those goals, I already have knowledge, skill, experience, A, B, and C. I've already got some sort of relevant foundation. But in order to achieve these goals, I'm missing E, F, G, or X, Y, Z. This part, this last part that I've highlighted here and is currently highlighted, that is the real essence of the why MBA answer. So the rest of that was more lead up, right? It was if you assume you've already shared your goals, right? As I looked ahead to these goals, I already have a relevant, not necessarily in these exact words, it's just the idea, foundation in A, B, C. A, B, C are certain types of knowledge, skills, or experience that are relevant to those goals. But in order to achieve them, in order to fulfill my vision, in order to achieve them, I am missing E, F, and G. Elaborate. Now, the question is asking why MBA, and if this is asked as a standalone question, why MBA? Like why? double question, but standalone, meaning not tied to your goals or not tied to why a given school. Excuse me. This is really, you have like 2 minutes, or you got to answer why now also, but you've got time to go into this. So look ahead to these goals. I already have a relevant foundation in ABC, but in order to achieve them, I am missing E, F, and G. Now elaborate. This is some sort of knowledge, skill, experience. These are your gaps. This is what you're missing. This is what you're missing and need to acquire through an MBA program. Doesn't need to be 3 either. Like it could be 4. But I am a fan of crystallizing these, right? That's no accident that I keep using these, A, B, C, E, F, G. I want you to crystallize and render concrete and render specific. Specific to you, specific to your goals, specific to your growth, specific to what you have accumulated to this point, but are now missing in the middle here in order to achieve this future vision. I want you to be really specific and really concrete about it. What are those 3 or 4 things that you're missing and need to acquire through an MBA? You could spend a couple of sentences elaborating on each. That could include what you sort of do have but really don't have yet, why or why this is important. And you do that for each of these, right? A couple of sentences elaborating on each. Make these, I said you specific and goal specific. You don't always need a 4th bucket, right? Could be 3, could be 4. Make these you specific, make these goal specific, but don't make them all the same. Make sure they, is something in here could or should be related to like hard knowledge or hard skills. Another should or could be related perhaps to leadership development. Or if you're going the entrepreneurship route, is there something you need to learn how to build, and lead businesses and manage teams and motivate teams, leadership development. Well, to this point, I've had the good opportunity or the good fortune to lead A and B, but I haven't led large teams yet. And through an MBA program, I need to gain, more awareness about your leadership style, your leadership strengths and weaknesses, your leadership voice, how to mobilize teams. If it's entrepreneurship, how to scale businesses. Could the 3rd bucket be something related to networks and recruiting? So the point is to make these concrete, make these specific, and diversify them. Sometimes if I hear people practice this the very first time, they'll say, okay, I need an MBA because I need marketing knowledge, operations knowledge, and strategy knowledge. And I say, ooh, that's all just kind of classroom knowledge stuff. That if you need hard knowledge like that, make the hard knowledge 1 bucket or 1 category, and then give yourself the ability to cover other MBA relevant topics with these other categories. Again, I've used the examples of leadership development or networks and recruiting. Or is it, something related to entrepreneurship or something related to really specific to a certain industry you're in, or hands-on experience doing something. Experiential experience doing that, if that's not redundant. So that's why MBA. Why now? Don't forget about why now, right? Sometimes they say, why MBA, why now? Give some real thought and body to why now. And also, if you get this question at the same time, sometimes you're answering why MBA, you kind of go into depth and detail on that. Give your answer. Keep the clock in your head because you also have to answer why now. You might say something like, I call it a little step back. You say, so that's why MBA. You also asked why now. It creates this little pause or separation, almost creating a sensation that you're answering now moving into that second question or answering the second part of the question. So that's why MBA. You also asked why now. There's several reasons. There are also several reasons why I think now. is the right time. You can see I'm teeing up this several reason thing again, because I think that a why now should likely have, and usually does have, a couple of different layers to it. For some people, this could be, it's a certain career juncture or a certain, time in the military has concluded. So there might be a logistical element. Okay, there's a logistical element. But is there also a readiness element? You've had the opportunity to live and work in these many different countries. You've gathered XYZ experiences. And through those experiences, your goals have become clear. You know what you want to do with the MBA. You know where you want to go. You've already begun to connect with people on those career paths at the specific program. And so your goals are clear. Something about readiness. And maybe there's even a third part where you're aware that MBA programs are two-way street. The experience of you and your classmates is only as good as what you're giving to the program. So are you ready and prepared now, based on the XYZ years of experience that you have, to be a unique contributor to the classroom? You don't have to click into your whole contributions answer there, but you could show some awareness. That's just an example. It's just a hypothetical example off the top of my head. But there I gave you kind of a logistical reason why now, a career juncture reason, a readiness or clarity of goals where I want to go reason, and a readiness to contribute reason. So think about what your layers and specifics would be. And again, why MBA, why now comes together in a question. Look for that separation. And don't talk for too long. Try to make that whole thing maybe 2 to 3 minutes. Why MBA plus why now? Another big point on this. If they just ask you why MBA, why now, I would not yet go into school specifics. I think that that's a decision you should make beforehand. You should say to yourself, well, you have to listen to the question, right? If they say why MBA and why Booth in the same question, okay, of course, answer them together. But if they just say why MBA, why now, to me, you should focus not yet on the school. Save the school specificity for the inevitable question that's going to come, which is, well, that's great. Thank you so much for that. And why Booth? Why are you so interested in Booth? Now you could go into why Booth. The reason for that is, I think when people don't make that decision beforehand, they trip themselves up. They're thinking of say, okay, they asked why MBA. Should I start mentioning school specific? Should I not? You sort of equivocate in your head, and then you end up, I don't know, half-heartedly sprinkling in a couple of specifics about the school. And they're like, oh, they talked about the school, but they didn't know much about it. To me, if they just say why MBA, why now, I would keep the school stuff out of it. You could even say something toward the end of your answer, toward the end of your why MBA. You could say, so those are the reasons I believe an MBA is the necessary next step in my life and career. I'd also be happy to share, of course, why I believe Kellogg is the ideal place to pursue that MBA. That way you're showing awareness that you want to go into those specifics. But if it's just why MBA, why now, I would keep it to why MBA, why now, and not yet go into the school specifics to avoid this kind of equivocation or this half-hearted delineation of why that school. Why that school? Of course, okay. Be ready for that. For every why I have it written here is like XYZ school. This could be why Booth, why Kellogg, why Columbia, why MIT Sloan, why Stanford, why Haas, why Tuck, why Darden. I mean, you name it. It's almost a guarantee you're going to get asked it. Similar logic here, by the way. So now on this grid, we're over here. You answered the goals before. You answered why MBA. And now we're here. So again, think about clustering or categorizing this into 3 or 4 different buckets. What is it uniquely about that school that fills these gaps or fits with what you're looking for? Diversify these, crystallize and diversify these just the same way. I'll use the EFGH. Again, sometimes, by the way, these clusters can carry forward from your YMBA. So if you've created this kind of, I don't even need to use my hands because we have the slide here. If you've created these 3 clusters, these 3 buckets of, I need an MBA because of E, I need an MBA because of F, and I need an MBA because of G. You could, not always, but you could carry those same clusters forward and then say how Columbia or NYU Stern or Darden or Duke or Michigan Ross uniquely fills or satisfies each of those three buckets. I have two legs coming off of each of those here on the screen. It's basically a reminder, or again, a baseline framework, something for you to run with, to say, okay, serve up or share for each of these three categories of why Ross or why UCLA Anderson or why Johnson. Provide two specific references or reasons or things that exist at the school that will uniquely fill that gap. These could be courses, clubs, professors, extracurriculars, case competitions, conferences, unique strength in a certain area. You obviously want to tailor these to an extreme degree. I mentioned earlier, inhale the propaganda of the school. This is where that hyper tailoring comes into play. If you've had conversations with students and alumni, they can get woven in here. But the point is, again, crystallize these around 3, maybe 4 buckets, have a couple of specific legs or references or talking points within each bucket. Watch out for how you organize your verbal delivery here as well. The first big reason why Ross is its focus on action learning. Okay, well, now personalize that. Why is action learning so relevant or resonant with you? Is that the best way that you learn? How does that fit? Why does that fit with you? What are a couple of the ways or examples? I was speaking with so-and-so, a current second year, who was also hoping to make the transition from an engineering background, who actually has successfully transitioned from an engineering background to consulting. And she was telling me how the MAP program, she did a project advising a financial services organization in Canada, how the MAP project helped her build, so obviously make that yours and make it real and make it better than what I just did. But now I'm within this action learning bucket, hands-on learning, unique to Ross, carrying that example forward here. And I'm talking about MAP and a conversation as leg 1 of that. If it's enough of a substantial kind of leg within that bucket, then you don't need a second leg. But I don't know, maybe there's some other professor or course that caught your eye where they really focus on action learning as well. And you could reference that as a second example. Tailor these, again, tailor them to the school, tailor them to you. If it's Columbia or NYU Stern, location is going to be a huge element. Decide, is location going to be one of my 3 or 4 reasons that I want to tackle head on? And if so, how am I going to talk about that? Or do I want location to permeate and enhance, to be present or palpable within all my other kind of why that school buckets as well? Again, diversify these, tailor them to the school. Don't just laundry list resources, right? This is here. It's not a contest who knows the most. It's not a contest about who knows the most about the school. You really want the feel and the fit to come across as well. For certain of these categories, perhaps the more professional ones, or the ones more related to knowledge, well, maybe you are going to mention some more black and white resources for those. But if you have another bucket here, and you probably should, about the culture and community of that school, well, that might be more of a feel kind of thing. When you visited campus, how did you feel? When you've spoken with alumni or students, what were those conversations like? How supportive? What have you heard about the school and its mission and the kind of DNA or makeup of its candidates? Or Tuck's focus on recruiting people who fit with their mantra of wise leadership. Like, you could just, again, inhale the propaganda of the school, understand what they stand for. For Berkeley Haas, the 4 defining principles. You got to make sure that this stuff is in there. It's not just a resource contest. It's, why do the resources and strengths of that school fit with you? Why does the culture and or location and or community and or approach to leadership development fit with you as well? cluster these, categorize them into bucket. The first big reason why Ross is, elaborate on that. The second big reason why Ross is, when I'm working with applicants, I even encourage them to use that language. The first big reason why Ross is. The second big reason. The reason for this exact verbiage is, I think a lot of times when you're in your elaboration, you need to provide a verbal signal to the listener that you're now done with the first big reason, and now I'm into the second big reason. The third big reason why Ross is. And if you have a fourth, again, make them yours, cluster them. Segue to the next big question, core question here. How will you uniquely contribute? Not every school asks this. So I think with the questions that preceded this, they're usually going to be there in some form. They might get clustered. Look in the blue here for Booth. All the different ways they ask this. Okay, this is kind of classic. But look at this interviewer. Why MBA and how does it tie to your short and long-term goals? You need to now merge those and answer them kind of together, and maybe reduce the length of your answers a little bit in order to fit all of that in there. But here now, why MBA, why now, and why Booth together? How do you merge and marry that? By the way, if that's the case, I would probably, if you do get like why MBA and why that school at the same time, I would probably synthesize this down to, just maybe a sentence about each of the why MBA nodes. And then I would focus most of the answer on why Booth. If you put yourself in the category of individuals who use the same, or if you are among the individuals who kind of create why MBA and why school categories that are the same or kind of flow into one another, then you could sort of address them simultaneously. But if you do get why MBA and why our school at the same time, I think the real specificity lies with the school. Make sure you answer why MBA, but don't dilute your why that school answer too much. When you go through interview reports also, by the way, I have Booth up here just on the topic. I'll sometimes see a little question like, what about the Chicago approach? Or if it's Haas, they might say like, well, what about the defining principle? A lot of times I think that people, well, if you see those questions coming right after why Booth, it is probably because the person, the interviewee, the person interviewing, they failed to sufficiently address that in their main answer. If you're answering why Booth, the Chicago approach should be part of your answer. If you're answering Columbia, intersection of theory and practice, location, it's gotta be part of your proactive answer. If you're answering why Haas, the defining principles, and why those resonate or fit with you, it's gotta be part of your original answer. If you're seeing follow-up probes around that, they could ask one-offs on those, but a lot of times I think it's because the individual unfortunately, failed to answer the question. Failed to include that as part of their original answer. All right, how will you contribute to the school? Not every school asks it. Look, Booth, I have less frequent written here, but we want to be able to answer it, and I think we want to actually make sure we answer it in the interview. So at the end of your why, couple options for this. One is in your why XYZ school, you could add a contribution bucket. Your EFG, what would this be? H? I'm also focused on how I can uniquely contribute. You could proactively add, you could proactively add a contribution bucket here. Another option is when you get to the end of your why, Booth or why Haas, you could say, so those are several of the reasons I'm so interested in Booth, and I believe Booth is, the ideal place and ideal fit to pursue my MBA. I've also heard about and been very focused on Booth's Pay It Forward culture, and would love to take the opportunity to share how I believe I can uniquely contribute. You could sort of try to set it up yourself. So a couple of options there. One is that you wait for and maybe get or maybe don't get the contribution question. Another is that you insert the contribution, make contributions part of your why that school. I just had it there. Or you use that kind of tee up or that setup at the end. I'm also happy to share how I believe I can uniquely contribute. Now you're into that contributions question. How will you uniquely contribute? How will, now, a lot of you will have done some essays on this already for other schools. Wharton Essay 2 is a contribution essay. Duke Fuqua is a contributions essay, 500 words. Cornell, you have two options with that essay, but they have an impact essay. So some of you have done this already and are familiar with it. We want these to be super specific contributions. It's not just, I'm going to go and, I'd love to run for president of the such and such club. I want to know what you're going to do as president of that club. What are you going to bring or create based on the knowledge that you have from speaking with people already in that club or at the school, or what you believe you can uniquely add? Just like in those essays, I'd love for you to think about sort of a major contribution 1, major contribution 2, and then a minor contribution, maybe a more fun one or something that could be 3. Think of this like a whole 2 to 3 minute answer. Specific contributions. Think Columbia Essay 3. How can you co-create? It's sort of a de facto contributions essay in a sense. What can you uniquely bring to the school or create? We want to go beyond the basics here. Sometimes I say to people, you have a little bit of a step back, meaning what is the basis? Why do I believe I can make this contribution? What's my basis? Do I have a unique background or skill in something? And that's brief. And really the step forward, let's say look back instead of step back. Look back. And then look forward. That's longer, more specific. What is the actual contribution idea? How does it create value at the school? Again, I'm not just going to run for such and such a role. Here is what I envision doing and how that creates value and how it solves a problem or brings people together. Then do that again for your major contribution 2. Make these different. If one is more professional, make the other maybe more personal or community oriented. Have a little third one here at the end. You can think of this maybe as 40% of your answer, 40% of your answer, and 20% of your answer. All right, let's keep on going. Those are the core questions. Let's try to spend 15 minutes on behavioral and self-awareness questions and some others, and then we'll just tick through quickly some of that school-specific customization I was talking about. All right, self-awareness questions. Again, this is my own titling. This is my own, clustering or organization so that you could go into these interview reports, take a look at them, and then distill or organize. There's an ad for the upcoming interview event. All right, you go into, here's Duke. You go, oh, gee, okay, look at all these questions. How do I organize these? How do I make it something that I can really prepare for and organize my thinking around? This is not an exhaustive list. These are just examples of what I call self-awareness questions. What is your leadership style? What role do you typically play in a team? What are your main strengths? What are your main weaknesses? What would your colleagues say about you or your friends? Or what would your manager say about you? What 3 words would your colleagues use to describe you? For these, this is really the structure right here that I suggest, and it applies in a sense to all of these, or at least some of them. So if they say, what is your leadership style? I say to people, brand it, elaborate on it, and then offer a mini example or a supporting or an illustrative example. What do I mean by that? Brand it. Brand it means don't bury the lead. Say, if they say, what is your leadership style? Say, I would say that my leadership style is blank, or I believe that my leadership style is defined by blank, blank, and blank. Brand it. Answer the question. Don't bury the lead. Don't hide your answer. Don't be unclear. Just say straight away, I believe that my leadership style is defined by blank and blank. What I mean by that is, now you're elaborating on it and just kind of explaining what that means. A good example of this, now you're into a mini example. A good example of this came just last year when I was responsible for blah, 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 blah. We're outside the office. I use the term mini example there intentionally to differentiate against behavioral questions, which we're going to look at on the next slide. Behavioral questions are, tell me about a time when you led a team. Tell me about a time you overcame a challenge. Tell me about a time you persuaded others to adopt your opinion, and on and on and on. Those questions are, the entire response is oriented around a single example. Here, there's other content that you're kind of delivering in the beginning. So the example might just be a little shorter, or you might offer 2 mini examples, but the whole answer is not like a 3-minute example. It's a little bit of an abridged, in my view, example. So brand it, elaborate on it, offer a mini example. You can do the same thing for what role you typically play in a team. What role do you typically play in a team? Brand it, elaborate on it, offer a mini example. If there's some sort of adaptation or multiple roles, offer a mini example for each. If your leadership style has evolved over time, offer maybe a mini example of each, or the lessons that you've acquired. You have to look out for also, like, I'm just offering a couple of examples, not exhaustive, not official. You have to look out when you go through the interview reports for other variations of these questions. Some schools will actually say, what is your leadership style? And please provide an example. Or they'll say, what is your leadership style? And how has it evolved over time? Others will say, who is a leader you admire most and why? I've seen MIT for a while, seemed like they were into, what is your communication style? Let's go down. Booth happens to be at the top here, so I keep going to it. What kind of team? Oh, here you go. What is your leadership style, and what leadership traits do you want to develop? What kind of team do you work with the best? What kind of roles do you shine in the most? And then some of the others. For something like, let's move this down to the top of the next page. For something like, strengths, weaknesses, and like 3 words XYZ would use to describe you, pay attention to the question. Are they asking about the main strength? What is your main strength? What is your main weakness? Is it plural? Did they ask for 1? Did they say 3? Is it plural? Is the question plural? You kind of want to go into these interviews having brainstormed in advance. I would say for strengths and weaknesses, I want to have brainstormed 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses for myself. I want to pre-hierarchy those before I walk into the interview. So that way, if they only ask for my main strength, I know which one I'm going to go with. I know which one I want to highlight about myself. 3 words they would use to describe you. Now, you could also decide, like, how different from the strengths should these be? What other themes do I want to highlight about myself? If they do ask about 3, then I would not do this for all 3, because that gets too long. Or it would have to be like, brand it, like item 1, quality 1, brand it, elaborate on it, like 1 or 2 sentences that kind of illustrate it. Quality 2, brand it, elaborate on it, 1 or 2 sentences that illustrate it. Quality 3, brand it, elaborate on it, 1 or 2 sentences that illustrate it. If there's ever any time toward the end of it with like weaknesses or even some of these qualities and stuff, if you want to throw something in there about how you hope to kind of improve or develop around, or how you've already undertaken steps to improve or develop on certain weaknesses, by all means, I think put those in there. Connect the dots. You could, if they ask you about weaknesses or areas for development, say what it is and why you think it is so, but also share ways that you've potentially already begun to work on that, and steps you hope to take at that school, specific steps you hope to take, or resources you hope to avail at that school to further work on that. That is connecting the dots between interview questions. And again, yeah, develop an idea beforehand of the qualities or themes you'd like to cover about yourself. Play to your strengths, right? Like think, what are those interesting things or unique things about you that that you really like? What are those, what I usually say with clients, what's your special sauce? And look for opportunities here to get those across. Behavioral questions. All right, so tell me about a time when, share an example of, here again, you can, and you really want to with these. Here's Booth. Here's just me going through recently, a few recent Booth interview reports, and here's just a bunch of behavioral type questions that they asked. You can do this for every school. Hey, here's Columbia. These are, again, not exhaustive, not comprehensive. You got to look at this stuff for yourself. Behavioral questions could ask about anything, right? Here's Kellogg. Tell me about a time you faced a challenging situation. Tell me about a time you received constructive feedback. Tell me about a time you resolved a conflict. Tell me about a time you dealt with a difficult colleague. But what you can do, I think I have MIT down here, and I've got Stanford down here. Stanford's are a little more unique too, right? But what I want you to do with behavioral questions is pour yourself into the interview reports, build your own kind of raw lists, and then you can often cluster these. So yes, I have like a dozen of these written here, but you know what? All of these, let's see, all three of these are about developing a team or building a culture or supporting others. So could you have the same example ready in your head if you get something like that? These are about overcoming obstacles, right? So it doesn't mean even if you build a list of 20 to 30 behavioral questions, these are about overcoming a challenge. Sometimes there's little nuances in it, right? You had to solve a roadblock, you saw a challenge or problem, but you can cluster these. I don't need to keep doing this for every single one of them. This is maybe a little bit different. It's overcoming a challenge, but it's with foresight. It's foresight, insight. Maybe this one could kind of go here. Point is, and so on and so forth. Point is, you could cluster these, and you will usually be able to build some sort of baseline where you're like, all right, like I gotta have to be ready with like a fail over. Tell me about a time you failed. Tell me about a time you overcame a challenge. Tell me about a time you resolved conflict. Tell me about a time you led a team. Tell me about a time you worked in a diverse team. Tell me about a time you navigated ambiguity. You'll be able to put your finger on the pulse a little bit about how each school orients themselves, or whether they kind of lean into certain of those clusters more than others. You then can build a mental bench of examples, your most interesting stories to answer these. Okay, if I get failure, tell me about a time you failed, what am I going to use to answer that? Or tell me about a time you overcame a challenge, or tell me about a time you received constructive feedback. What am I going to use to answer each of those? I think you can usually get to the point, and this is like an old metaphor that in the digital age doesn't always land, but I often say to people, and I've said to people, take take a piece of paper, fold it into fours, and you now have 4 quadrants on the front and 4 quadrants on the back. Now you have 8 capsules. Create 8 stories in those capsules. Those 8 stories will usually give you everything you need. You have those 8 stories on your mental shelf, and depending on what questions you get in the interview, you can deploy different of those stories. We do want to have a mix of stories, though, not just, sometimes I do mock interviews and I'll ask 3 or 4 behavioral questions, and every story is a professional story, or every story is a really technical professional story. You're going to lose the listener if that happens. Draw from a mix of stories. Create a flexible bench in your head. Again, each of these stories, a lot of times a certain story can be used. Flexible bench means a certain story can often be used to answer a variety of questions. Tell me about a time you created impact. Tell me about a time you led a team. Tell me about a time you overcame a challenge. Maybe that's the same story and you just use it. Don't use the same story twice in an interview. And don't save your best stories for questions that might not come. Lead with your best story. So you could kind of grid these out, right? Choose your examples wisely, unpack the value, and then organizationally, it's the old. So what are we looking at here? Behavioral questions. Let's fix that typo. Behavioral questions. Now, MIT Sloan, they're right here. They always used to say, we have what we call a behavioral event-based interview, BEI. They used to have a great page on it on their website. I actually looked it up on the Wayback Machine to see if I could still pull it. I just like the way it talked about how they approach their interviews and how they and how you might think about constructing your stories. At MIT, they still do have kind of behavioral oriented interviews, but don't let that fool you into thinking they are only behavioral questions. You could see my little kind of quick mock-up here for MIT. Here's that different kind of opening question I talked about earlier. You won't always get it, but you might. You're still going to get asked, most likely, these kind of core questions. Looks like Sloan synthesizes them more often than some other schools do. Be ready for that. We talked about the core questions and how to mix and match and synthesize. That's something we could go into greater detail on if we were to do interview prep together. It's hard to cover every kind of permutation of that on a call like this. But MIT Sloan will probably lean into a few behavioral questions as well. Stanford, same thing. I don't know that Stanford officially tags them as like behavioral event-based, but you'll still get some of these kind of questions. A lot of times for Stanford and MIT, these like the why Stanford, why MBA could come at the beginning. It might also actually come at the end of the interview. But Stanford will also, again, orient around 3 or 4, usually 4 for Stanford behavioral questions, and they will probe the heck out of you usually with these. So the structure for them on that MIT Sloan webpage of yesteryear, they used to say every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's true in your essays. It's true here in these interviews for behavioral questions. So behavioral questions. Tell me about a time when. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I'll just put result and lesson. So what I've just done here is added or inserted what I would think about as being the substance of the beginning, the middle, and the end of these stories. These are example-driven stories. You're pulling one example off that mental shelf. Tell me about a time when. Tell me about a time you developed someone or a team. Tell me about a time you supported others. The beginning of the story is the situation and maybe the challenges that were involved in that. The situation is brief. It's who, what, when, where. Last year, when I was working as an associate at JP Morgan, I raised my hand to lead our blah, 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 blah initiative. That's the situation. Now I know where it was last year. It was at JP Morgan. I was an associate there, and I'm leading such and such an initiative. This was uniquely challenging because the beginning. Now the middle of the story is action, action, action. You'll notice here too, by the way, there are elements of the STAR, which is situation, task, action, result, or some more simply situation, action, result. What I like to do, I call it SCARL. If I have any clients out there joining right now, they will know this well. And it looks like this. Situation and challenges, action, 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 results, lessons. The reason the SCARL approach, the difference is, and the reasons for it, and we're into that middle section with the actions. I like you to have multiple actions. Layer your actions. Don't talk ad nauseum. Don't make this 5 minutes. The whole answer, this whole example should be like 2.5, maybe 3 minutes. But I want you to have, first I did this, then we did this, then I did this. Multiple actions. I think with these up here, these more classic formulations, I think it risks oversimplifying the actions. It makes it sound to me like somebody waved a magic wand and this grand problem was solved all of a sudden, or this conflict with a coworker was magically solved. Action, action, action. Give it some body. First I did this, then we did this, then I did this. That's the middle of your story. The end of the story is the result. What happened? Was there impact? Was there lasting impact with that? And I think equally important, any lessons or insights or extrapolations to something else in the future. Looking back on the experience, I think it was a great lesson in how to, or a great reminder of, there's the SCARL approach. That is your baseline, your framework for all these behavioral questions. If you get a question about a couple other little quick notes here, if you get a question like about conflict, it really could be for any of these schools, some a little bit more than others. So look in here this is Kellogg. Be ready for this for any school, but Kellogg, it seems to pop up a little bit more. If there's conflict or a difficult colleague, when you go through your SCARL, when you talk about your actions, don't make it sound like you were forcing them to adopt your opinion or you were right. Now, you might get a question about, tell us about a time you persuaded others to adopt your opinion. Okay, great. But if there's a conflict or a disagreement with a colleague, don't make it sound like they were they were such a jerk and I knew what was right and I had to teach them or reprimand them. It's not about that. That's almost an orange or red flag. The green flag, as they say these days, would be more, we disagreed. And the first step I took was wanting to understand, the reason for our disagreement, why we were approaching this or coming at this from different angles. So I invited Joe to grab coffee. He was new to the firm. I knew he had a background in marketing, whereas I had a background in finance. And over the course of that cup of coffee, we got to know each other a little bit better. We also got to understand and explain our differences and approaches to that problem. So the second step we took coming out of that cup of coffee was to get the rest of the team in the room. And so obviously I'm making this up, but the point is, if you have a conflict kind of question like that, it's not about reprimanding somebody or show understanding, listening, outreach, creation of harmony, consensus building. If somebody's not holding their weight, that's another question you get sometimes. Somebody's not carrying or holding their weight. Why is that? Did you sit down with them and try to understand where maybe they had some challenges going on in their personal life, and how you could maybe then help or support. So those are the behavioral questions. That's I think the main content for today. We covered core, self-awareness, and behavioral. I think we covered them at pretty good length here. There's always more we could do and more we could do and more we could do. What I'm going to do now is just hit some of these additional and one-off questions a little bit, and then we'll just run through some of these school-specific questions a little bit more, and I'll fire off some thoughts I have about some other important questions as well. Additional questions, miscellaneous questions. In theory, obviously, this list could be endless. These can get more school specific, right? In theory, yes, it could be endless. They could ask you anything. You could have an interviewer who goes completely rogue. Once in a while, you'll see that with like an alum interviewer who just has their own style or their own way of doing things. But other questions, I mean, what do you do outside of work? What's a fun fact about you? We'll pull up Booth in a second. I've seen a couple there. For Columbia and Duke Fuqua, I mentioned it earlier. Where else have you applied? Is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up? What questions do you have for me? That's them. Now that's you asking them questions. Let's look at some of these examples to illustrate this further. Booth. So these are the core questions up here for Booth in some form. You'll sometimes see, by the way, I got these little asterisks here. You'll sometimes see questions. These would be, I would categorize these almost as one-offs, but they're school-specific one-offs. What do you think will be most challenging about your time at Booth? I saw for several years, I don't see it as much anymore. Booth was asking like, what do you hope your legacy will be at Booth? You know, among alumni, what do you hope your classmates, and when you're an alum, what will they kind of remember you by? I used to see Tuck ask a question like that as well. Here you see Booth asking, I've seen this a little bit more this year, how do you juggle multiple priorities? How do you prioritize among conflicting tasks? It's not specific to how you will do that at Booth, but it's asking how you do it in general. Okay, what do I do there? I probably want to brand it, elaborate on it, and provide a mini example, just like with those self-awareness questions. You could say or lead that then into, and I know that, you know, looking ahead to Booth or looking ahead to whatever MBA program it is, this is a challenge inherent to, it's a challenge I welcome, but it's a challenge that's inherent to any MBA experience. We'll have a lot of academic demands, social demands, recruiting demands. Then talk about, do you have a certain framework or do you have a certain idea headed into the school about how you hope to prioritize your time? What are your two biggest priorities while you're there? Do you have then a set of secondary priorities? And then maybe some other things you want to kind of try and experiment with, but more as like a member or a passive agent. Think about the specificity of these. A video like this does not afford us the opportunity to really offer up true design for these answers, but would obviously love to and welcome the chance to do that with you. For Booth recently, I'm seeing, you know, I saw a couple of these. Do you have any role models? Tell me about a person you've met with who has broadened your horizon. So again, these are, what was I saying up here? These are core questions. These are behavioral questions. And these are kind of, you know, additional or miscellaneous. You could sometimes move these around and categorize them. Tell me about a cause you're passionate about. Columbia, you see a lot of this. What is your plan B if you can't achieve your primary goals? Well, we want to make sure that they're asking that because they want to have confidence in where you're going to land post MBA. Have you thought about this? What would be your kind of secondary recruiting path? Is that still a credible path? Is it one where you would give them confidence in your ability to land there? Have you looked into that at all? Is it something that is a recruiting? Does it still lead you? Why is it still appealing to you? Does it still lead you toward your medium and long-term goals? Where else have you applied? That's a big one for Columbia and Duke Fuqua. Be ready for that. Talk about, I mean, again, too much for a call like this, but that's something we would want to think about, strategize on, and design. The point of my comments right now are be aware of and ready for any kind of miscellaneous or one-off or questions schools, you know, certain schools seem to prefer to ask. I saw that Plan B question a little less frequently for Kellogg. I saw it once in a handful of interview reports I was looking at recently. Tell me about an extracurricular activity that's especially meaningful to you. What other hobbies and interests do you have? Or what do you do outside of work? MIT often, but not always, asks about those little essays. So MIT is one of those schools that has seen your entire application. Harvard, NYU, MIT have seen your whole application. MIT what motivated you to get that topic you addressed in your diversity interview essay. What motivated you to get involved in that? Or they might ask you about the data visualization essay that you submitted. Another big one here is there anything else you want to highlight? A little less frequent for MIT because those are tighter 30-minute interviews with admissions. But I think for a lot of schools, you'll see it, like Kellogg, you'll probably see it, I don't know, half the time, maybe a little more than half the time. Is there anything else we haven't covered that you'd like to share? It's usually the last question they ask you before they turn it over to you for questions. Don't just put your hands in your pocket with this question. Don't just say, no, that's it. I think that's a wasted opportunity. What you want to do here is first, I think it's kind of sort of a waterfall strategy. The first thing is there really anything else that you either missed or didn't speak long enough about, or were kind of regretting in the back of your head? You're like, gee, I didn't, I mentioned Columbia's location, but I didn't really lean into it. Okay, if there's something like that, then use this as your safety valve to revisit that topic. Earlier we spoke a lot about why Columbia, and I shared several of the reasons why I am so interested in Columbia, why I think it's such a great fit, many of the things I hope to get involved in, and how I believe I can uniquely contribute. I mentioned the value of Columbia's location, but I'm not sure that I even emphasized it as much, maybe not exactly those words, but you could have the opportunity now and then go into. So I mentioned earlier the value of having professors who work in the industry coming and teaching so many classes at Columbia. But there are so many other ways that I think location is important, and that underscore why I want to do my MBA in New York City at Columbia, and then go into 3 of those reasons. Use that as your chance to go into those. So it's a safety valve. Maybe that contribution question never came. Tell me, how do you believe you can uniquely contribute to our program? Maybe it never came. Use that here. You say, earlier in our conversation, I shared a lot of the reasons I believe there's a lot of the reasons I'm so interested in MIT Sloan. One thing, I didn't delve into in great detail is how I believe I can uniquely contribute. Would it be okay if I shared a couple of those ways right now? So you could use that as your contribution safety valve. Even if there's nothing else that you thought was super important, don't put your hands in your pockets and just let the interview end. Use it as a conclusion. I really appreciate all your questions. I think we covered a lot here today. I'm not sure that there's anything in particular that I felt like we missed or didn't cover, but I would just like to use this opportunity to share that for all the reasons described, from blank to blank to blank, to blank to blank to blank, and reiterate and re-highlight some of the things you mentioned earlier, I really and truly believe that School XYZ and I are an ideal fit. Something about the culture, something about feel, something about when you visited or talked to the people there. Maybe reiterate some of the unique ways that you've envisioned contributing to the school. Turn it into a powerful concluding paragraph, so to speak, like as if it were an essay, and use that here instead. All right, let's try to wrap in 2 minutes. You will want to have questions for them. I would say having at least 3 questions is kind of a good baseline here, but watch the clock. I said it earlier, I'll say it again here. Use your social awareness, your professional awareness. If the interview feels like it went a little bit long and there's only 3 minutes left until the end of the time, then don't overdo it. You could say, I ask a question and let them answer it, and then say something to the effect of, well, I'm also happy to, ask your first question, let them answer it. Ask your second question, let them answer it, and then say, I just want to be cognizant of time. I know we're supposed to wrap up in about 2 minutes here. Do you have a hard stop at the top of the hour, or would it be okay if I ask one more question? You might even, if it's really running up against time, you might have to do that sooner. But conversely, again, if it's not, if it's an alum, if it's somebody who seems chatty, don't artificially cut it short either. You could kind of say, how much time do you have a hard stop at the top of the hour. They say, no, I could actually go for another 5 or 10 minutes, because you don't want to cut short what would or could be a great conversation about the school. So don't just have 3 questions, have more than that, and think live too about what would be interesting to continue talking about. Let's wrap up there for today. Obviously, there's a lot more we could delve into in terms of school specifics and how they cluster some of these questions, what to watch out for. I think we covered a good amount of that along the way here today. Feel free to reach out. We'd love to work with you on your interview prep. We have that 15% discount available using GMAT Club 15 at checkout. Our interview prep is very comprehensive, very detailed. We're going to workshop your answers. It's you specific, it's school specific. Feel free to reach out, avantiprep.com. We wish you the best of luck. Thank you.